Hello everybody, welcome to the I Am IT Geek YouTube channel. My name is Shabazz Dar and as ever I am the IT Geek. Welcome back to this AZ700 series. We made a start by looking at site-to-site VPNs in the first topic, which was 3 episodes. And today we're going to start the topic of point-to-site VPNs. But before that, I want to say hello to my co-host for this whole series. Hello, Saj.
Hello, Shabazz. How you doing?
I'm not bad, brother. How are you?
I'm all right. It's good.
Good, good, good. I hope you're all fresh and ready for your demos today, mate. Got some cracking demos, haven't we?
I've got some cracking demos. Fresh at 9:30, I'm not sure about, but yeah.
So we're obviously me and Saj have day jobs. We're doing our recordings in the evening, but that is what community is about. Sometimes is that is that your caffeine?
I've got caffeine. I can't take coffee at this time of night.
I've got water to keep me hydrated. So yeah, as ever, Saj is with me for this series. There are going to be the odd episode where Saj isn't with me now. Again, we've mentioned at the start with AZ700 there's a lot of practical stuff. There are certain topics which unfortunately we just don't have the access to try and provision. One of those being express routes. So in a few episodes time or a few topics time, we're going to be talking about express routes. So we are going to do demos where Saj's going to do demos where he can. But there's one episode where it's just going to be me doing theory, just because we don't have the facilities to provision an actual express route. I don't own a data center. I don't know about you, Saj, but I definitely don't.
No, unfortunately. So yeah, we'll do what we can. We'll show you where you go to deploy an express route circuit in Azure. We'll deploy the gateway for an express route. But like Shabazz said, we're limited what we can demo, unfortunately. But we will talk about it. We'll go through it.
Yeah, I've got as much detail as we can. So let's get stuck into today's episode. So, as I mentioned, we are still doing the AZ700 Designing and Implementing Microsoft Azure Network Solutions exam. This is obviously the prep. Specifically today, we are still on Module 1, which is Designing and Implementing Hybrid Networks. Specifically today, this is part 1 of the Design, Implement and Manage Point-to-Site VPN Connection. So we're going to start off by talking about, how do we go about selecting that appropriate SKU. We'll then jump into looking at planning and configuring a RADIUS authentication. On the flip side, we're also going to look at certificate-based authentication, and this is where I will hand over to Saj, who's going to do a demo on configuring RADIUS authentication. So that'll be something to look forward to. So let's get stuck in. Start off by talking about selecting an appropriate virtual network gateway SKU. So when you create a virtual network gateway, you specify that gateway SKU that you want to use. So you do that during the creation process. But obviously, you need to make sure you understand, which SKU to use. And this is all dependent on specific requirements. So select the SKU that satisfies your business requirements. And that can be based on the type of workload, the type of throughput, some of the features. And also SLAs, because each SKU has different SLAs as well from Microsoft. So, we need to make sure you select the appropriate one. And what you can do is you select the SKUs by the tunnel, by the connection, and by the throughput. So these are just some of the options you can select the SKUs by. So sticking with the topic of the appropriate networks, virtual network gateway SKUs, the resizing of the VPN gateway SKUs is allowed within the same generation, except when you're resizing the basic SKU. So that's something you'll want to remember for the exam, because that could be like a try and trick you sort of exam question. So that's resizing of the VPN gateway SKUs is allowed within the same generation, except the basic SKU. So remember that one. If you have a lot of point-to-site connections, it can negatively impact your site-to-site connections if you have those as well. The aggregate throughput benchmarks that these have been tested by maximizing a combination of site-to-site and point-to-site connections. So a single point-to-site or site-to-site connection can have a much lower throughput. So it's just one thing to note, that the point-to-site connections can have a negative impact on site-to-site connectivity. So keep that in mind. There are, to help customers understand the sort of relative performance of SKUs using different algorithms, we can use publicly available tools One of them's called iPerf, I believe, and there's like a CTS traffic tool as well. And these help you measure performance of site-to-site connections. What I'll do is in the link, I'll put a link to both those tools so you can have a maybe closer look at those. Might be worth, if you're doing the labs, having a play with those to actually have a look at the performance. So let's move on to planning and configuring RADIUS authentication. So this is obviously something that Saj is going to do a demo on shortly. So remote authentication dial-in user service, which is what RADIUS actually stands for. This is a network protocol that secures a network by enabling centralized authentication and authorization for remote users. Microsoft Windows Server role that you can use is called Network Policy Server, or NPS. And this acts as a RADIUS server and supports RADIUS authentication for on-premises hybrid networks. Azure AD enables MFA with RADIUS-based systems. So, if a customer wants to apply Azure AD MFA authentication to any of the previously mentioned RADIUS workloads, they can install the Azure AD multi-factor authentication NPS extension on their on-premises window NPS server. So something to note. And sort of some example workloads are VPN, which is obviously what we're talking about, VDI, and also Wi-Fi. So you can use RADIUS authentication for these type of workloads. Obviously, in this instance, we're focusing on VPN. So again, you know how I like to do my diagrams and kind of explain through the power of diagrams what I'm trying to get at. So if we look, we've got the VPN client here. This makes that kind of initial request to the RADIUS client. And then we have kind of the next step, which is that RADIUS request. So that goes to the RADIUS server. And also in step 3, you have that primary authentication with Active Directory on premises. We then move on to step 4 and 5. So step 4 is that sort of RADIUS server doing the MFA request to Azure, which then does the MFA authentication. And then the MFA request goes all the way back to the actual VPN client. Finally, we have that client connection. Once the MFA has been allowed, we then have that client connection. So just continuing on this topic of planning and configuring RADIUS authentication, let's take a closer look at some of those RADIUS components that were in that previous diagram. So we first had that client application, which is that VPN client, and that sends that authentication request to the RADIUS client. We obviously then had that sort of RADIUS client, which converts requests from the client application and sends that to the RADIUS server, or the NPS server that has that NPS extension installed. So when we talk about that RADIUS server and that NPS extension, this triggers a request to the Azure AD MFA authentication for that secondary authentication that we need. Obviously, if successful, that NPS extension completes the authentication request by providing the RADIUS server with a security token, and that includes the MFA claim, which is obviously issued by the Azure Security Token Service. Finally, we had that Azure AD MFA, and this is what communicates with Azure AD to retrieve the user's details, and it performs that secondary authentication that we need. And it uses various methods of verification, which we can use, like text, mobile app, etc., or like a FIDO key or something like that. So before we hand over to Saj to look at RADIUS authentication, let's move on to talking about certificate-based authentication. So certificates are used by Azure to authenticate clients connecting to a VNet over a point-to-site VPN connection. We've got different types of certificate types. First of all, we have enterprise certificate. So if you use an enterprise solution, you can use your existing certificate chain. You require that .CRE file for the root certificate and that you want to use. We then have self-signed root certificate. So if you aren't using an enterprise certificate solution, you can create a self-signed root certificate yourself. Otherwise, the certificates you create won't be compatible with your point-site connection. and clients will receive like a connection error when trying to connect. So if you are using certificate-based, you need to use one of these two, okay? And you essentially, that root certificate, be it enterprise or self-signed, you upload that public key into Azure, obviously, and that's where you configure your point to site as well. So I'm going to hand over now to Saj to do the demo. So that is over to you, Saj.
Thank you, Shabazz. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, cool. So unfortunately, this is one of those things that we can't demo end to end. Now, Shabazz mentioned RADIUS authentication. For you to provision site-to-site VPN or point-to-site VPN using RADIUS authentication, you need a RADIUS server, and we don't have a RADIUS server in this test lab. So if we just look at this now, we make this link available to you when this video is published. So essentially, you set up your point-to-site VPN tunnel to Azure, but it needs line of sight to your on-premises RADIUS server. Unfortunately, we don't have that. So I'll quickly run through setting up and deploying a point-to-site VPN with your RADIUS authentication. We won't be able to do it end-to-end. So in the previous videos, we went through deploying a virtual network gateway, which is what you need to set up a point-to-site VPN. But just to quickly go over that, everything in Azure is deployed to a container called resource group. So essentially, you would come into resource groups, deploy yourself a resource group, deploy yourself a virtual network, create, provide the relevant information that you need: resource group name, region. So if you quickly just step through this: resource group name, test 001. Give yourself an IP address. So you need a VNet range, which is /16, which will give you, well, by default it's /16. You can change it. 65,000 IP addresses. It gives you default subnet, which is inside the range that you define here. /24, which gives you 250 IP addresses. You can't use 5 of them. They're reserved by Azure. You can change the name here. Give it enable security, but if you're testing, configure what you need to configure, leave it disabled for the defaults. Give it some tags and then complete that. So you've got your resource group, you've got your VNet. Once your VNet is deployed, you come into your VNet, you go into subnets, you define yourself, you create yourself a gateway subnet, which is called gateway subnet, and arrange that doesn't overlap with anything you defined previously. And then you're ready to go. So when you deploy your virtual network gateway, you deploy that into a resource group. You need to define an available subnet. You pick a SKU. So you want VPN, route-based ideally, not policy-based. Watch the previous videos for Shabazz's definition, where Shabazz defines the difference between the two. You've got different SKUs for testing purposes. Pick a small one, it will cost you. Pick your generation, pick your VNet that you've created, that's available, and then public IP address one will be allocated to you by Azure. Give it an appropriate name, tag and create. So once it's created, you are presented with a virtual network gateway. This can take about 45 minutes an hour to provision. So within point-to-site configuration, you have the ability to deploy configuration here. And if you look in here, you have Azure certificate, but you also have RADIUS authentication. Now, if you select RADIUS authentication, it will ask you for your primary server secret, second server IP address as an optional, and second server secret. So you would need the IP address and the secret of your RADIUS server, which is your on-premises RADIUS server here. And this only works if your point-to-site VPN client has line of sight to your RADIUS server, which you don't have in this environment. Also, something to bear in mind that this will only work from a site-to-site VPN connection to your RADIUS server. Express route in this connectivity from Azure to your on-premises environment isn't supported. So it's something to bear in mind for the exam. It might come up. As part of the demo, unfortunately, that's all we can demo as far as RADIUS authentication goes. Like I mentioned, unfortunately, we don't have a RADIUS server in this environment, so we can't demo it end-to-end for you. But once you've deployed your virtual network gateway, select your authentication type, RADIUS authentication, provide your primary server IP address for your primary RADIUS server and your key, and it will connect. And as I mentioned, site-to-site VPN from Azure to on-premises is the only configuration supported for this express route is not supported for line of sight from your client point to site VPN to your RADIUS server. Shabazz, back to you.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Saj. Sorry, I kind of unshared your screen for a second there, but I think I added it back. So yeah, I think what Saj has obviously shown us there is in the portal where we can provision the sort of site to point to site VPN, and also gone through some prerequisites like the requirement of a site to site VPN connectivity for your MPS server can communicate with Azure. And obviously, the information that you need, the MPS secret and all that sort of stuff, you get that from provisioning your MPS server. So if anybody has like a home lab, you can, by all means, try provisioning that in your home lab. There is, again, we're going to put the link to the GitHub Labs in the description. We'll also put a link to that URL that Saj showed us as well, so you can that'll help you provision an MPS server for your lab if you need.
So yeah, that steps to end-to-end connectivity is pretty good, that link. So we'll provide that for you as well.
Excellent. No, that's great. Thank you very much, Saj. So that was part one of this topic of point-to-site VPN connection. So this is a three-part topic. So yeah, we're pretty much done with this part of it. In the next part, we're going to be the demo will be actually configuring Open VPN authentication. So I think that'll be a bit more involved with that lab, Saj. Is that right?
Yes. So we'll set up end-to-end connectivity on that, and we'll go through that for you.
Excellent. I think as far as topics go, we've got two topics we're going to focus on, which is going to be planning and configuring Open VPN authentication. That's going to be the lab as well. And then we're going to look at planning authentication by using Azure AD as well. So that'll be two interesting theory topics. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you again, Saj. And please, do like, comment. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm adamant I want to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year.
Yeah, so please subscribe. Let's get Shabazz that magical figure.
Please. But yeah, again, thank you everybody for your support, the comments. And honestly, if you use these videos and you pass, do let us know. It's always nice to hear when you've helped somebody. Saj is going to pass the exam after these labs. I'm adamant.
After these labs, so I let you know.
Excellent. So yeah, thank you everybody for watching. But up until next time, thank you and goodbye.
Bye everyone.